Welcome back to the Rescue One podcast. Thank you guys so much for listening to this and every other episode that we have. This episode, I interviewed Battalion Chief Dena Ali from the Raleigh Fire Department. She's also the author of several articles in fire engineering regarding mental health, leadership, and sometimes the lack thereof in regards to mental health. She authored the book Hope Out of Darkness, and it is a guide to first responders' mental health. In this book, which I loved every single page of, I can't say it enough, she talks about not just the problems in the U.S. Fire Service with mental health, the rate of suicide, and the misconceptions around those things, but she also talks about how to take action, which is one thing I'm just sick and tired of. I'm tired of just the constant awareness level of mental health in the U.S. Fire Service. I think we're all aware of the problem. I want to know how we're going to fix it. And she goes through a lot of the tactics, both from a administrative level down to the company level, of how we can start to solve these problems before firefighters start having issues. And I learned so much from this book. I was dead wrong about many, many things that she brought to light. And I think personally, this is a good case for optimism. I think the big takeaway for me was that we are getting better at this. That there are certain things that are probably worse than I thought they were, and there are certain things that are actually better than I thought they were, and it's super interesting to me. But she kind of digs into it a little bit, and we just talk about a whole other slew of things, from leadership all the way down to culture in the U.S. Fire Service and her fire department and my fire department and things like that. So I hope you get a lot of enjoyment out of this episode, and please share it with people that you think could get good use out of it, especially if you're involved in peer support and mental health in your department. So without further ado, please enjoy this episode with Battalion Chief Dena Ali. What advice would you have for somebody who's not an officer yet, or who's an officer who wants to move up to a different position, like how to find mentorship and who to model yourself after?
I think that's a really tough question because there are so many great mentors out there, but sometimes you take some from everybody. And then sometimes people let you down. And so I'm careful not to put everything into one person, or not to, want to model myself completely after one person, for many reasons. But we're all different people and we have different ways of communicating. We have different biases, different experiences. So I've learned, because I think, like many people early on, I was drawn to certain leaders who inspired me, who just seemed to be great. And I try to model myself after them. And I would find that I'm not them. And if I do what they did, sometimes it doesn't hit right. But also, and I don't know if you've experienced this, you may work with somebody or work for somebody and think they are amazing and everything they do is great, and you're going to model yourself after them completely. And then you work with somebody else and you start seeing gaps, and you realize, like, they were great at these things, but man, we miss these things. So that being said, I've kind of gotten to the point where I'm constantly still looking at the way people communicate as a model, and the way people show up, or the way people make me feel as a model. But I don't think there's just one or two people that we should ever model ourselves after, if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, it does. I kind of didn't think about it that way. And this all in my mind, it ties to your book, but when you are like thinking about yourself, because you're a battalion chief now, and you've been promoted for a few years, 3 years, 2 years, 3 years. Yeah. And I mean, now it's not one firehouse that you are having to, lead, it's multiple. And so how do you, especially with having written this book now, how do you try to be a mentor to other people? Because kind of whether you like it or not, you are, that's like part of the job description. And I think some people kind of forget that. But how do you like, what's your insight now that you've been up there for a few years, like what it's like to be in that spot where people may be looking to you as a mentor?
I think the biggest thing that I've learned in the years, and it's amazing because every day I'm learning things, and I'm still screwing up. I actually recently screwed up, and I think in the moment when we screw up, it's the worst thing ever. So it feels like, oh my gosh, like I'm at this point in my career, I shouldn't be making these kinds of mistakes. I'm above that. I'm beyond that. So it feels hopefully worse than it is. But still constantly learning and growing. But the biggest things that I've learned, especially in the last year, is in the position I am in. I don't have as much grace. People are looking at me as a mentor. They are looking at me as somebody that's going to guide the way things are supposed to be done. And if I speak out of line, or if I ignore a policy, um, that's construed in a whole different way than being on the engine company or being another firefighter. So with that, the biggest things that I've learned is, from the minute I show up to the minute I go home the next day, um, eyes are on me to do what's right and to model what's right. And another thing that I've learned is I have to be really careful with what I say. It's very easy to misinterpret what's said, or it can be very easy to say something that could bother somebody or be misinterpreted. So another thing that I've had to learn is to be careful. Like, words are really powerful, and be careful how I communicate about our administration, how I communicate about, because that after you run a fire call or after there's some unique incident, you're at another firehouse and everybody's asking. And despite the fact that we're all these selfless servants, oftentimes it seems like people are trying to find, oh, what did somebody screw up, or what, I heard this happen, tell me about this. And I've found myself kind of getting pulled into that and like laughing and joking, or like, oh yeah, that. But I've realized, like, I can't do that. That's wrong. You always have to communicate in a way that uplifts the people around you and then uplifts the people that aren't there. And you have to give everybody grace, because we all make mistakes. Like, every single one of us, every call we make mistakes. So in talking about calls, and that for me has actually been probably one of the hardest things, is because you show up at a firehouse and you get pulled into the conversation and you want to be a part of the conversation, you want to have the conversation. And I've the hardest piece is just learning, like, I have to temper how I communicate back. I'm not a part of this crew.
Hmm.
I'm not one of the guys anymore. And so I have to be really careful not to get pulled in and not to, accidentally, join in and be a part of, conversation that is not appropriate at my level. So
That's got to be tough because I mean, you spend how long were you a captain?
almost 6 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, same crew the whole 6 years.
Um, First year was at one house, and then the next five was at another house, and the crew changed. But towards the end, yeah, we were very tight, pretty
Yeah.
good crew. And no, that's the biggest thing for me is you spend your whole first, half of your career plus living in the firehouses, being part of the crew, learning how to be a part of the crew, navigating the conversations, and then it is like on the job training as a battalion chief, and stepping aside and stepping out and just maintaining a little bit of a line between you and the crew. And it's not easy because we all want to be a part of the crew. We all want to, like, have a good time and laugh and joke and have that family environment, but it's not always appropriate.
Yeah. Um, Sometimes the inappropriate conversations are the most fun to have. But I think like so the reason I bring up leadership so much, and we're talking about your book today, but um, you know, in attending your classes before, in reading this book, and talking to you just informally, I've understood more and more that leadership has such a huge role in the mental health of the individual, and it's a lot about what we've set up as an organization to create a positive environment for people, and that has a very deep meaning when I say positive environment, from what I've learned. Um, and it also means that it's very susceptible to failure. You can do a whole lot of damage just by not being there for people, and it's so crazy. And so, to start off, Can you tell me like what drove you to write the book? I mean, I saw on your Instagram like you were going around interviewing tons of people, and the amount of people that you interviewed for this book must have taken you, I don't know how long, but um, just gathering all that information and everything. I mean, was there like kind of like an aha moment, or did you have this idea for a long time?
It was one of those things where, starting in 2016, I started writing articles. And the articles didn't even, there was never like this idea that, hey, I want to be somebody that writes articles. It was, hey, this is a topic that interests me and there's not information on. In 2016, suicide in the fire service was something that we were becoming more aware of, but we didn't understand, and we didn't understand solutions. So I started researching that because, as you read in the book, like there's personal components for me, uh, and it was really just like therapeutic for me to find solutions and see that they're out there. And then it was empowering for me to be able to take some of these solutions that I'm finding, especially I found, the Joiner Lab at FSU, in Florida. They
Mm-hmm.
were they were studying first responders, and they were putting out papers where they were saying, hey, here are some of the problems we're finding, and here are some recommendations that should be implemented to make a difference. And then here is where the research needs to go. And so they're doing this, and I'm starting to read these articles. I'm like, how come nobody in the fire service is talking about this? How come our leadership isn't sharing this? How come there's not policies being developed based on this research? Like FSU, they were looking at firefighters. They were getting quantitative data, qualitative data, and they were sharing really good information, and they were offering really helpful solutions. Yet it was just the paper would get published, and it would just forever be published with no avenue to share. So for me, it became really cool to know that I could read that information, use some of my personal experiences, some of my insight, some of what I observe as a first responder, because, these papers are getting published by people in a university. And though they're interviewing first responders, they're not first responders. So to be able to translate this research into firefighter language, and also like tie in some firefighter story, and then I was very fortunate that I developed a relationship with Bobby Halton, so I was able to send the articles to him and get them put in Fire Engineering Magazine, which was, I mean, it was amazing.
Yeah.
So it was just super empowering to take this good research, take observation, and then give it to somebody who could share it nationally. And if I couldn't get people around me to understand what I was saying, or I couldn't walk into my leadership and say, hey, we need to do this, because initially some of the things that we were finding, like the recommendations for peer support and how holistic a lot of the solutions were, those weren't well received because everybody was looking beyond, simple to complex solutions, like having psychologists, referring people to, treatment, and skipping kind of peer support for a more sterile, like therapeutic, checkbox. So, initially when sharing, hey, here are some things, it was kind of dismissed and misunderstood, or, you know, well, we need a psychologist that can say that we should do this,
Hmm.
but we didn't have a psychologist that could. So a lot of it just got stuck. So being able to have it shared nationally, and it's amazing how like me and my community can take research, put it in an article, and around my community, they'll look at it like, but somebody in another community picks it up and says, oh, hey, a firefighter wrote this, cited this research, let's do it. And it's like that for a lot of people in a lot of areas. Like our department, our area will take stuff that's being published from other areas because it's like, oh, if it's published, then we should use it.
Yep.
But it's harder for us in our own agencies to present that. So that's kind of how it got going. And so I was in graduate school at the time, and after my first article was published, I got paid for it from fire engineering, and I used that to help pay for my next class because tuition was expensive. So initially, I just got passionate about the research, and then I wanted to do work every semester or every class that could potentially be published, so then I could continue to pay for classes. So that's where I started writing the articles. And after a while, I realized I had several articles, and at first they get published and read and appreciated, and then after a while they just kind of die. So there was, before the book was published, there was a lot of people. There were probably 2 or 3 years saying, hey, you should write a book, you should write a book. And like 99.999% of people were like, there's no way I could write a book. I don't have the ability to write a book. I'm not going to write a book. And then finally, I don't know what inspired me, but finally I was like, you know what? I'm curious. So I actually, because I have a file on my computer of all my articles. So I just copied and pasted them into one Word document and just to see. And I was like, oh, wow, this is over 100 pages. So I just submitted that as a manuscript to fire engineering. They reviewed it and they were like, yep, you can write this book. And so I just started with all my articles, putting them in order. That's kind of the first part of the book. And I edited it to move away from like an article to a book.
Yeah.
Was able in my articles, I didn't share personal stories too often. I didn't make it personal. It was all, I always try to write it like professional, from a research perspective. So it was taken seriously. But for the book, I wanted to like write them in a way that I guess connected better with readers. So like I edited it to connect. And then I just, after I put like that first part together, I started thinking about everything that I've learned and the solutions out there and what I wanted to share. And so literally it was like a one chapter at a time, like, hey, play is such a fascinating thing, that a lot of people don't understand. I want to write an article about it. And then understanding humor and how humor benefits us, I want to write an article on humor. And then the whole third part of the book, this is actually, I took our North Carolina Peer Support 2-day peer support class, and I turned it from 180 PowerPoint slides into part 3 of the book. So the whole third part of the book is basically a consultation guide to peer support. It's everything we teach peers: the active listening, um, how therapy works, finding clinicians, how to have difficult conversations, when to refer. So it's everything we teach the peers put in a book, because what I realized is I felt like our 2-day peer support program was really good, but there's no way we can reach everybody.
Yeah.
We don't have the to teach everybody. So I wanted to put it down to where, if you need that information, but you're in Alaska, well, here you go, just get the book.
Yeah.
And that was
Cause
another,
I imagine a lot of people were asking you, right?
yeah, that was another thing I didn't think about to right now is, for maybe the last 3 or 4 years, I would get emails constantly from
Yeah.
people. Hey, I want to start a peer support team. What do I do? Hey, my department's tasked me with being this person. Can you share everything you know with me? And at first I'd get an email like that and I'd, spend time replying and putting stuff in, but it got really exhausting. And, I realized, wait, I've done this hard work and you're just asking me to hand it to you. So I said, let me just put it in a book. And so from now on, when people ask, hey, just go buy the book, it's there.
Yeah. Especially because it's not just the tools, right? Like I took tons of notes on, I am a member of our peer support team. So I took tons of notes just for my own use, right? Like the tactics in there, which are great. But it's, when it's talking about the foundations of peer support and understanding some of the cause of it, and then just the philosophy of trying to stop people from falling in the river upstream before fishing them out, which is really good. You know, there's I have my own like group of questions that I have on it, and there's some topics in there that I feel like are extremely deep, or both philosophically, but also just like medically. Like there's a lot of medical reasons and side effects to having mental health issues, which is just, it takes a huge toll on the human body. I don't know if we knew that that long, but just to go back to originally what you were talking about, at FSU when they were studying this stuff, do you think the reason that it didn't get out, was just, I would assume it's just because it's a published medical research paper. I mean, fire chiefs aren't scrolling through the National Institutes of Health looking for this kind of stuff. So it could have been sitting there for a decade or more before somebody kind of just points it out and says, like, we need to do this. Because other than that, how are we as a fire service actually taking an understanding of the progress we're making on mental health with tactics and strategies to like make it better and putting it into practice. I mean, other than, I don't know, just maybe going to a conference and listening to somebody talk and saying, let's put this into practice. You know what I mean? So it's like, do you think more along the lines is like that kind of stunts our progress, is like we're not actually seeking out the experts?
I think so, but also what I've seen and what's frustrated me is sometimes we'll rely on organizations to give us recommendations, right? And I won't name them because I don't want to sound like I'm dismissing any organization, but we all know there's national organizations that are committed to helping in certain areas. But for the longest time with mental health, and I don't think anybody knew that this was harmful until recently, but we were sharing information and data about mental health in the same way we would share it about line of duty deaths, right? So we want to teach firefighters, firefighters survival. And you do that by saying, hey, if you don't do this, this, and this could happen. And this is really bad. So this is why this is so important. And you share like the worst case scenario, learning RIT drills and air consumption and all that. You kind of learn those worst case scenarios. Then also, anytime in the fire service we need money or funding, we have to express the need for it. So if there's not a true need, how are you going to get that funding? So that's
Yeah.
why you see us, sharing, the data behind cancer, and all these other dangers. So with mental health, it just seemed logical, the same thing. If we can show people that this job contributes to mental ill health or this job contributes to suicide, then we can get funding to do what we need. So with that, sometimes we would look at the research and we would share the data, just a little piece of data that could sell it. So I remember there was a paper published about PTSD in the fire service, and it was a survey that was sent out, and it was one of those self-report surveys. So you didn't get a good population that answered. You got a convenience sample. You got the people who saw it and then took the time to click on it, which we know if you see a survey and it doesn't affect you in any way, you're not likely to click on it. We have other things to do. So with that, if it's a survey about PTSD, you may get inflated numbers of people who have been affected by PTSD.
Makes sense.
So this survey, when it was published, it came out and it had just this really high percentage of firefighters who will have PTSD in their career. But if you went to the very end of the article, it explained, here are the limitations. We don't believe this is a true number. This is what we need to do to get the more accurate number. And it said that at the limitations. However, several people, several like organizations, influencers just took that number and said 39%, I think it was 37% of firefighters will have PTSD in their career. And that I saw that over and over and over again, but that wasn't true. That wasn't a correct number. So initially, we were just taking the data that would sell the point that this is a problem. I'm sure you've seen, firefighters are 3 times more likely to die by suicide than in the line of duty. That got thrown at us over and over and over again. That came out of a 2007 dissertation that a psychologist did as she was getting her PhD, where she looked at every firefighter in North Carolina that died, looked at the death certificates and compared line of duty to suicide. And in doing that, she found that 3-1. However, there's so much more to that story, because the way it was initially shared was, wow, you're 3 times more likely to kill yourself as a firefighter than die in the line of duty. And this is a dangerous job. So it really scared people into thinking that something about this job was making people kill themselves. But if you actually break it down and understand the numbers, first of all, we'll understand that the national suicide rate is 14 per 100,000. The national line of duty death rate is 3 per 100,000. So already, nationally, suicides exceed line of duty deaths. And then if we really look at the numbers for firefighters, and this was done before they were even using like cancer. So I think if you ask, how many firefighters die annually, it's always said about 100, but now it's much lower than that. Like it's much lower than 100, unless they get the data where they look at cancer
Yeah.
and whatnot.
Then it's a lot more. Yeah.
But so naturally, suicides for all populations, not just firefighters, for all populations, far exceed line of duty deaths. And then for white men, it's even higher. So, like the suicide rate in the United States is 14 per 100,000. But if you're a white male, it's 25 per 100,000
Hmm.
because white men are more likely to die by suicide. That's just the numbers. So, all that to say is that that data, there was so much behind it that wasn't expressed. So that data was taken to make people believe that this job is causing suicide, when the truth of the matter is that data mirrored general population. It really didn't have much to do with the job. However, what was really frustrating that I saw, and I think this will finally answer your question, is
No, it's great.
that dissertation by Dr. Savia. Not only did she share that data, she shared her observations of what was contributing to mental health and suicide among first responders. And a lot of it was really powerful. She talked about women and minorities and how when they don't feel like they're a part, they could isolate, and isolation and alienation are things that contribute to suicide intention. She talked about bullying, hazing, making people not feel like they belong. She discussed all those things and a lot of the leadership that we talk about and ensuring that people feel like they are a part of the team, that they do have something to offer. She talked about all of that. And what was frustrating was that was in 2007, and none of that was ever shared. All
Yeah.
that was shared was firefighters are more likely to die by suicide than in the line of duty. So we need money and funding to create task force and to make a difference. And then I think what happened is for a little over a decade, I would say almost 2 decades, we, as a fire service and researchers involved, fell victim to confirmation bias, where you're seeing the message and you're hearing the message that trauma exposure, PTSD causes suicide. And so firefighters are dying by suicide because of trauma exposure. Firefighters are having PTSD because of trauma exposure, which very logical. But just like with military populations, and we're seeing now, for example, they found there's zero relationship between combat and suicide. And many of the military members dying by suicide did not even deploy. And then the military is also finding, which we're finding, that PTSD doesn't just occur in a vacuum. It's not just the exposure to trauma or the bad calls, it's exposure to that. And then, as Sebastian Younger says, which I always love, it's a disorder of recovery. It's lacking the resources to heal, lacking the community, lacking support, not sleeping. If you already have poor sleep, and then you have trauma exposure, it's worsened, and then that makes everything worse. Um, you know, I think, well, I guess just even settling on the sleep part, but then also the coping skills. One of the research papers published by Dr. Joyner was about alcohol use disorder among first responders and just alcohol use, and that was in 2015. But we know that first responders, when they are stressed, when they're having a hard time sleeping, or when they're celebrating, there's alcohol involved. A lot of first responders will say they drink to help them sleep at night, or they drink to help them, deal with stress. But the data has found there's this really sick bidirectional causation of alcohol and PTSD, and then PTSD and wanting more alcohol, and it's really dangerous. So all that to say is we got stuck in the confirmation bias of bad calls are messing us up, as opposed to really drilling into no, what's actually messing us up. And that's where I appreciate that you pulled, a part that I really tried to focus on for the book is upstream, not just pulling people out of the river, not just waiting for people who are struggling with PTSD or who are in crisis to support them, but let's go upstream before they even fall in, and let's keep them out of the water. And that means helping them understand why sleep is so important, helping them understand why natural sleep is so important, helping them understand why having strong social relationships are important, helping them understand why having rest and having hobbies outside of work, how those keep you healthy. And then again, of course, leadership, helping leadership to understand how their behaviors and how they make the people that work with them feel can affect the mental health of the people that work with them.
Yeah, there's so much there. But the first thing I wanted to tackle is, so what would you say the key takeaway is to know, like if people are listening to this or after they read the book, what, especially after they read the book, what is the key takeaway about firefighter suicide that we as a fire service need to know? Like, is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Is it you hear the word, you'll hear the word epidemic thrown around, like that is an epidemic of there's an epidemic of firefighter suicides. What with all of this is the key takeaway? Like what does the real picture look like?
So I would first and foremost, from what I know and believe, is let's just drop firefighter from it. And especially if we want to continue to use the word epidemic, because it is true in the United States, suicide rates have really gone up for all populations. I mean, since 2000, they've gone up by 37%. Surprisingly, during COVID, they dropped when people thought that it would be the opposite. They dropped, but that didn't last. And after 2020, they continued to rise. Whereas worldwide, suicide rates are dropping. So in the United States, suicide rates are going up. Worldwide, suicide rates are dropping. There are a couple of, but not many, a couple of other countries that have increasing suicide rates. But those countries have commonalities to the United States, in that they're countries where people are not as community oriented. You know, there's a lot of success, there's a lot of education, there's housing markets are booming, uh, development and technology is booming. So it seems like in the communities where suicide rates are increasing as opposed to decreasing, people are out for themselves. People are going that life alone in a way. And I think in the United States we see that. We see the older we get, the longer we stay in our careers, the more our social connections kind of fall apart. um, Not for everybody, but for a lot of people. And so I don't know of any data that truly has found that firefighters themselves are seeing an epidemic of suicides. Now, I will say that anecdotally, like especially in the last year, we've seen some firefighters die by suicide that had influence on a lot of people. And it was just really difficult. But we're seeing that for all populations. And I feel like I'm going in circles, so sorry about that. But I just want to say, because I think if we continue to only look at firefighters, we'll continue to fail to see what the true problem is that's contributing to suicide. Is it the inability to admit that we're imperfect? Is it the inability to seek support when we have had, a failure, or we have had something in life that's hit us? Because I know for me, and I was talking earlier how this month has been a little bit difficult. Like I made a mistake at work, and something was kind of embarrassing and disappointing in myself. And initially for me, I didn't want to talk to anybody about it because I was embarrassed. And I felt like I had let people around me down because of a mistake that I'd made. And it sucks that that is how I saw it, because like we all make mistakes. Like to be human is to err. And I shouldn't be ashamed to seek support when I need it because I made a mistake. So I think if we want to make a difference with first responder and firefighter suicide, we really truly have to give people permission to be themselves and to be their whole selves, including their imperfect selves. And I think the populations that are seeing the highest rates of suicide are the populations, especially because you're seeing it among successful people. It's not just firefighters. Doctors have higher rates of suicides. We know veterinarians have higher rates of suicides. And maybe just looking at those three populations is like, well, yeah, they all see death, but lawyers have higher rates of suicide as well. Um, so is it that they see lots of death, or is it that there's this expectation to be really good at what you do and to not err? So I think if there was one thing or one message, it would be like, truly, it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter how much success you've had. It doesn't even matter if you've been involved with first responder mental health and suicide and you're a part of a peer support team. Life hits all of us. And you may find yourself in a point where you're struggling, and you may find yourself in a point where you're ashamed. And that's human, and it's okay.
I think it's interesting that, like, after reading your book, and then also last time you were on the podcast, you mentioned the book Tribe, which I know you've talked a lot about, and I read it. Uh, it really explains a ton because the lack of community is so huge. And then the one that just constantly circles my brain all the time that was very counterintuitive was the military. That
Yeah,
combat does not equal increased suicide rate. And that blew my mind because I would have thought the exact opposite. That is so relevant to us.
yeah.
Um,
Soldiers not deployed
right,
are the ones that are struggling the most, the
right.
ones who didn't get to contribute.
And then, but in that explanation, it totally makes sense. Like the people who were over there that struggled together, that formed a bond, that have that community, that they needed to be there for each other. They had that huge, overwhelming sense of purpose that was greater than themselves. And I always saw the fire service like that, and I feel like it. Um, if you lose that for whatever reason, that's a huge risk factor. So, in your book, you talk a lot about several ways that can happen. I mean, you talk about leadership. You talk about a safe environment, and I wanted to bring that up because the word safety is, I think, really misunderstood. And like I've heard you talk about psychological safety, and when people hear that, they like shudder, and
Yeah.
because they think kinder, gentler fire service. This is, you can't hack it here because you have to have a safe space and all this stuff. And I've heard you explain it really well. So could you kind of explain what exactly that means? Because I think it's really misunderstood, and it's actually a really important topic to address.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. Psychological safety, from what I found, is so incredibly important. And you're right, because when we look at it in terms of, oh, psychological safety, uh, everybody has to feel safe and we have to watch everything we say, that actually produces the opposite of psychological safety. Because when you're in an environment where you're worried about saying the wrong thing, worried about making a mistake, worried about slipping, that's the opposite of psychological safety. That is the unsafe piece of it, and where that root comes from is the fact that humans are mammals. We're organisms just like everything else out there. And what's really neat is all organisms respond to cues of safety. And when cues of safety are present, we achieve homeostasis. And when we achieve homeostasis, that's when we're able to thrive, learn, grow, contribute, support. However, when safety cues are not present, the opposite happens. We go into that survival safety mode. And in that survival safety mode, we don't want to work together. We worry about everything we say, and that puts us in that fight or flight, which is just so damaging to our nervous system, which takes us completely out of homeostasis. And it was fascinating, like initially learning like just how cues of safety are present. And if you look at animals, you'll see how animals respond when they feel safe as opposed to when they feel threatened. And like if you have a pet, and your pet is so predictable, but then the minute there's a threat, your pet, like you don't even recognize them. They make no sense. You can't reason with them. Uh, it's the same thing with humans. And so when we learn that when people feel safe, they thrive, we understand that our goal should be to make sure the environment is safe because we want people to collaborate. We want people to work together. We want their cognitive functions to be strong because we want them to be able to reason, problem solve. And then on top of that, we want people to have empathy, like in connection from that. So that all comes from safety. And how do you produce safety? Basically, you allow people to be who they are and you allow mistakes and failure. You don't have an environment where there's this fear of failure. I heard somebody say it once, and it was really, really, really just simple. They said, if you are in an environment and you have to modulate your thoughts and behavior, that's not psychological safety. But if you're in an environment and you can be yourself, you can communicate as yourself and speak freely, And not, I mean, we all know like emotional intelligence is a piece of this. Like we shouldn't all be speaking freely, but we shouldn't constantly be worried about saying the wrong thing. So if you're in that environment where you're not worried, where you can share ideas like, hey, let's look at this idea. Or if something bothers you, you can say, hey guys, that bothered me. That's psychological safety. And that's the healthy environment. And it's not about just, you know, like kinder, gentler, like don't offend anybody, because we also should be able to say, hey, John, that really bothered me. And then you should have the opportunity to say, oh, Dena, wow, I didn't mean to. Thank you for pointing that out. I won't do that again. And that's how we grow and move on, as opposed to John offended me. I'm reporting him to HR. I'm going to have his job. Right.
I think so. You're talking about creating psychological safety, and what I'm hearing is culture. Like it's setting up a proper culture, and if you have a culture in your fire department that promotes, um, you know, all of that, there's these places where when a probationary employee is there, they get made fun of. They get, they get pranks pulled on them. They're in the crew, and it's not taken the wrong way, and the crew is comfortable in, those all of those just famous and infamous initiations in every firehouse where people are having fun at work, without the fear of, like you said, like run into HR. Like there's always a line to cross. You know what I mean? Like we can take it too far. Sometimes we're our own worst enemy. But I think when people hear, especially like the older generations, when they hear psychological safety, they immediately think newer generation, too soft to handle it. And you're like, it's actually, the word itself is being misunderstood, or the phrase, I'm sorry, itself is being misunderstood, when it's actually is like promote a good culture where you guys can be yourselves around each other. And I love that, because I mean, if that's, to me, that's like low hanging fruit. I'm reading this book and I'm like, this is something that should be existing just automatically in every firehouse. And it's weird because it's not. And I wonder if that was almost like a counterculture of like worrying about getting taken to HR for every little thing, if that had a negative effect on mental health. I mean, I don't know if you've seen that, or from your interviews, if you noticed that.
No, I definitely, as a woman in the fire service, I feel like I've seen and noticed that, because I know, and people have told me, when there's a female in the environment, people act different.
Yeah.
And then, you're talking about like all the jokes and whatnot in somebody's early career. Well, sometimes women and other minorities in the fire service don't experience those, because um, nobody wants to accidentally offend them,
Yeah.
or, you know, get taken to HR, not knowing that sometimes those initiation jokes, those rite of passages, are so important. Like I know, I remember a crew that I worked with where they played a joke on me, that like an outsider looking at it could be like, "Oh, that's so inappropriate." But in that moment, it was awesome that they were not afraid
Yeah.
to do this, and one of them caught it on video, and I love that because I still have the video. And immediately we all start laughing, and I remember for me in that moment, like that's when I was like, "Man, I am a part of this family. Like they're not afraid of me." Um, they have accepted me into their family,
Yeah.
to the point where they can risk playing a joke that, if there wasn't trust, may have gotten somebody in trouble. So that's when I knew I was part of the family, and I appreciated that. And I know from talking to a lot of women in the fire service, they've said that one of the worst things is when you are in an environment and it's so sterile,
Hmm.
um, that there's not that like family, the laughter isn't there, the community isn't there. It's amazing how, the pranks bring people together.
Yeah. I don't know of anybody who doesn't like want that belonging. And I mean, there's a reason you join the fire service, and it feels like you're losing out on a huge part of it when you don't get that. And it's like the crappier part is you. I mean, if they're holding back, like the rest of your crew is holding back from you, you might not even know. You might just, it might come out in other ways where you're feeling left out, or you're like, I don't really jive with them, or whatever else. It's really tough. The one of the quotes that really stuck out in the book for me, probably my favorite one, it was All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. What, like, how does that translate to the fire service?
Whew. I think there's so many directions you can take with that, but I'll just say for me personally, in just learning more, and it stemmed from psychological safety. So psychological safety, understanding reaching homeostasis, and then moving to understanding heart rate variability and how, you know, to increase heart rate variability, we have to rest more and we have to clear space. I know for me early in my career, and for so many others, you feel like you have to always be on and that you have to always be working. And if you get off work and it's a weekday and you're going home to take a nap, that there's something wrong with that. And I know today with our phones, when there's quiet space, you're on your phone and you're scrolling, playing a game or whatnot. And I didn't understand until just the amount of research I did how valuable being able to sit quietly is. How valuable, I was reading a book, The Comfort Crisis. Have you read that?
No.
And one of the things it talked about that was really damaging for people is how, we're filling all of this space.
Yeah.
We can't even stand in line anymore without multitasking
That's me.
or being on our phone or, yeah, yeah. And it was explaining how actually being able to stand in line and not be distracted, how beneficial that is for you as a person. Um, there's so many like you actually can make eye contact with somebody else and communicate, but also you're building that like mental toughness to be able to be patient, to be able to wait.
Huh.
And I realized me as a person, I have the opposite of that because I am always trying to produce more and be focused. And, you know, if I'm in line, I'm going to respond to a lot of emails. I might finally create something that I've been waiting for. And I didn't realize that that was actually causing damage.
Um, this kind of reminds me of a part of the book I read. You know, you talked about like giving yourself effort into suffering, like for post traumatic growth. I guess was the topic. Like striving to, I guess, what people would say, making your getting comfortable being uncomfortable. You know what I mean? And I had read and I was like, is this, you know, I'll take cold plunge for example. You know,
Yeah.
whether it's related to that or not, I don't know. Maybe you can make or break that connection, but you know, people want to put themselves under strain, under duress, under like pressure, or like suffer. Um, is that kind of the same thing, or did you mean something else? Like seeking to suffer for post traumatic growth is ineffective, I think, is what you wrote. You know, like to try to summarize it.
Yeah. Well, so we know that um, hardship can produce growth. We know that.
Right.
We know that from history, right? And even if you think about the people in your life who are the kindest, um, who just seem to be uh, the, I'm trying to think of a word and I'm struggling to come up with the word because it's not just kind, but also like most productive. Um, Going back to mentors, like thinking of like some of my early mentors, there was something about them. And I realized the reason that they were good at what they did, they worked hard and they were kind to people is often there was some sort of adversity that they had to overcome.
Yeah.
Because what I find is when things are too easy, people tend to go in the opposite direction. They get lazy. When things are too easy and you achieve too much without enough effort, you tend to look down on other people. So what I found is, and I think we all know this, is adversity makes for better people. And then in understanding post-traumatic growth, we know that trauma doesn't automatically lead to disorder. We know that it
Right.
doesn't. And for most people, it will in fact make you stronger, and that's the way it's supposed to work. However, it requires, just like mentioned earlier, post traumatic stress disorder is a disorder of recovery. It requires appropriate recovery. It requires being preloaded with those resources. It requires, just like the cognitive appraisal, being able to look at things and not just seek the negative in them, but look for the positive in them. There's all these pieces that, when done correctly, trauma will be positive. And I think James Stockdale is, to me, one of the best examples. He was shot down and spent 7 years, I think 7 years, as a POW in the worst conditions. I mean, he was in a 3-foot box. He had his legs shackled, bones broken. He was beaten. Um, I mean, the conditions were terrible. And if you read about him and what we've been told about post traumatic stress, it would be obvious that this guy would end up with post traumatic stress disorder and eventually, be disabled and unproductive. However, the opposite was true. Somehow that experience, and it was fascinating to learn, he even went back and said, of course, he would never ask for that, but he would never give back that experience. Like that
It's
experience
crazy.
made him who he is, and he appreciates it. So that's going back to that. You can't just seek out suffering. You can't say, "I want to go be a POW so that I can have the mental strength that James Stockdale did." You can't purposely seek out suffering to develop strength. It has to be something that you endure that you didn't have control over that will lead to the growth. And I think that's where that came from and why that's important. Because of course, as we teach about post traumatic growth and understanding that hardship makes you better, it could make somebody or convince somebody like, oh well, let me go seek out hardship. But unfortunately, voluntary hardship doesn't make you better.
Yeah, you're not gonna. I can't even try to wrap my brain around what would happen to like your pathways in your brain to say you had all this bad stuff happen, you got through it, and then it's like an equation at the end. You have all this positivity. I mean, it's just an appreciation for life too, I guess, but it's more than that. It's got to be some crazy evolutionary thing that we've had just wired in there since the caveman times. You had mentioned heart rate variability, so I think this is starting to catch on a little more because people are looking at it with their wearables, like for sleep.
Yeah.
And I know that that's probably the most prominent um like measurement where people are looking at this all the time. And you've done a lot of work on this before. And I was reading the book and I was trying to take notes on it to understand it a little more. What's the relation to HRV, to heart rate variability, and just overall what you have seen with the effects on mental health?
Yeah, so I think the easiest way to understand it is first to look at athletes. So athletes were the first to use heart rate variability as a biomarker to help them create a training plan and to understand when they may perform better. And then when they realized that their behaviors could affect heart rate variability, then they started to initiate those things that could impact heart rate variability so that they could use it to their benefit. So what athletes understand is a higher heart rate variability um, signals wellness and signals capacity to do more. So if you have a higher heart rate variability and you're a sprinter, you will have that capacity to be able to sprint a little faster. If you have a higher heart rate variability and you lift weight, you could lift a little heavier. And so with that knowledge, also lower heart rate variability signals the inability to withstand more. So if you have a low heart rate variability and you try to lift heavier, you could get injured. If you have a low heart rate variability and you try to sprint faster or harder or longer than you need to, that's when it can lead to illness. That's how the athletes figured it out. Is they understood that data and they started to use it to their benefit. And even an athlete that would wake up and measure heart rate variability and find that their heart rate variability was low, then they would you know change their training plan for the day to match that. Like, hey, you know what? Today's the day that we need active recovery. But vice versa, if they woke up and it was high, it was like, hey, why don't we go for a PR today? So then they started to understand, okay, well, how do we change our heart rate variability? How do we have more high days? And they realized that the more you rested, the more you engaged the parasympathetic nervous system, the more ability your heart rate variability had to increase. But not just to say like, okay, if you rest every day, your heart rate variability is going to slowly increase.
Yeah,
You also have to activate the sympathetic nervous
there's got to be
system.
stressors.
Yes. So heart rate variability is basically the balance between the sympathetic nervous system and the
Okay.
parasympathetic nervous system. It's a balance between the two. You've got your brake and your accelerator, your sympathetic accelerator, your parasympathetic brake. And it's that balance. But what we have to understand is you need far more sympathetic you need far more parasympathetic. You need far more rest to balance sympathetic. Because if you think back to caveman days, um, you know, how often were they actually stressed? And it was not all day, it was short periods.
Yeah.
Um, and then they had, you know, the sleep, the community, because there's no devices to keep them distracted. So it got dark, you go to sleep, you get your full 8 hours of sleep, you spent time with your community, you ate well. Then you go out forage, you may have to run, but you're sympathetic, very short duration. We know that. We know that when it's activated, it's not supposed to be long term, it's supposed to be short term. Parasympathetic, longer term. So today's world, there's a lot of dysfunction with our sympathetic nervous system. We don't realize, but every time your phone notifies you, there's like a little release of cortisol, a little like subclinical activation of the sympathetic nervous system. Going back to psychological safety. If you work in a firehouse and your supervisor is uncaring and they're just out to get you, you have that constant, slow, steady drip of cortisol, which is activating your sympathetic. So that's leading to dysfunction, which is really damaging the ability to regulate the heart rate variability. So in those environments, you'll see that lower heart rate variability. Whereas when we take time to do the things that can increase it, which is anything where you activate the parasympathetic nervous system or anything where you slow your breathing, that's when you have the opportunities to increase heart rate variability. So, of course, it's being around people that we connect well with, laughter, expressions of gratitude, sleep. Sleep is so incredibly important. Breathing exercises. And you mentioned cold baths. Cold baths have been found, and that's why athletes love doing the cold baths. All those things have been found to increase heart rate variability. And so for the longest time, that was just seen as something that would benefit athletes and benefit physical performance. But today, the research has now demonstrated that it's not just your physical resilience that it impacts, it's also mental resilience. So when you have a higher heart rate variability, you're actually able to withstand more mental stress. You're able to run those traumatic calls. You're able to be exposed to sleep disruption from working a 24-hour shift. The higher your heart rate variability, the more capacity you have to do this job. So that's why, and I don't know, I hope I explained it in a way that makes sense, but that's why we have to try to increase our heart rate variability. And we don't have to focus so much on sympathetic activities. I think we all know it's important to work out, exercise, but we don't always recognize how important it is to rest and recover and to
It
sleep.
makes so much sense because, all right, so the variation in your heart rate from low to high is what matters. Like, but what you're saying is you need to have a lot more periods of low than high. And if I'm sorry, low heart rate than high heart rate is what I'm getting. Like you're trying to create a situation where you allow your body to have enough rest and recovery so that you're basically more resilient. And I think the word resilience or like mental resilience, I don't think we understand it that well. And this kind of ties that into there's like a physical explanation to it, saying if you had to put one thing, and I'm sure there's multiple metrics, but a good metric to look at it is if you have high heart rate variability, there's a tendency that there's probably a higher likelihood that you're more mentally resilient to deal with stressors. But if you're in the firehouse and it's you could use the athletes, right, where they have like constant stimulus like physically and they don't have enough rest. That to us would be either an area that's or a work environment that's psychologically unsafe, or those constant stressors are just keeping you at a sympathetic peak and you're not getting any downtime with it. It could be stuff at home, you're dealing with your own mental, so you're basically constantly switched on and there's
Yeah.
never a switch off. And so your heart rate isn't varying, it's just staying like pegged all the time, like you're at 180 and you just basically don't get any real rest. And I'm sure like I'm using the heart rate as that, but it's got to feel like shit too. Like constant cortisol is not natural. It's supposed to ebb and flow. it's supposed to vary. And I'm, it totally makes sense. So that's the best explanation of that I've heard. I couldn't understand it with sleep for a long time. I'm like, it doesn't make sense to me, but this totally makes sense. So, what are you had mentioned a couple like with play, but what are the actionable steps? Like, how do you keep high heart rate variability? Because high heart rate variability is good. So how do we keep it high? What do we do?
Yeah, and something else that I recently learned, because we do talk so much about keeping high heart rate variability, but it's not just that. It's okay to have low heart rate variability days.
Sure.
And in fact, the more you not just have high heart rate variability, but also you experience the low days, the better it is. Because initially I remember when I was first researching this and studying this, I was solely focused on increasing.
Mm.
And then just to mind screw me a little bit, and then I came across the research that said, well, no, it's also having those low days too. So
There's balance
just
to the balance.
there's balance
I
to the
gotcha.
balance. But yes, like having high heart rate variability, having more variability is the goal. Is the goal there. And from all of the research I've done, it is ensuring that you're doing anything that slows your breathing.
Hmm.
Everything that slows your breathing. So fascinatingly, like I talked about laughter, and when you think about laughter, laughter does not slow your breathing. It increases it because you're laughing. But what we don't realize is in the period after that, you do, because of the homeostasis, you do slow down,
Yeah.
which is cool. Like when you are able to laugh, I mean, when you're laughing, it's hard to be preoccupied and it's hard to be worried
Yeah.
when you're laughing. And that's how I understand it is, so when you're laughing and you are able to, it does turn off those fear receptors, which can be sustained. I think another super important one that we don't do enough, and it goes back to you mentioning the quote about, our inability to be alone and alone with our thoughts. For me, one of the greatest things that I kept reading was the value of gratitude. And like everybody else, I was like, oh, yeah, that's great. But then I got busy and I didn't do it. Well, the more I kept researching it, the more I kept speaking about it and realizing that, okay, I should probably do what I say. I've made it more of a practice. And it was really great for me when I finally decided the way I'd make it a practice is in the morning before I even look at my phone. Um, Grab a cup of coffee. Now I've started a new habit of taking creatine and greens first thing.
Cool.
So mix my creatine and greens, and like now that we finally are in the summer, I can go sit outside for a minute. And before I look at my phone, before I think about anything I have to do for the day, I drink my greens and I sit there and I think about what I am grateful for. And sometimes it's just the ability to sit there and be relaxed. Sometimes that, and just that's what I realized there's so much more gratitude for, is having that space. Like if you haven't carved yourself time to just be, without thinking about what you have to do, without looking at your phone, without responding. If you haven't in a while just carved time to just sit and enjoy the moment, enjoy the sounds, enjoy the smells, um, enjoy, like, especially now the mornings feel so good, the temperature, just enjoying that, you don't realize what a gift you're missing out on. Because that to me, like just sitting there for a minute before I even start thinking about like, okay, what am I grateful for? Just sitting for a minute, it's amazing. It's
Yeah.
incredible. But yeah, so there's this abundant research on gratitude and how that can help with heart rate variability. Just thinking of a couple of things to be grateful for each day. Of course, breathing exercises. One of my favorites is the 4-7-8 breathing technique, where you breathe in for 4, hold your breath for 7, breathe out for 8. I think a lot of us are familiar with box breathing, where you breathe in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, hold for 4. And I did that for the longest time. But then when I read Ryan Munsey's book, he was talking about increasing heart rate variability. And one of the things he said was add a second to the exhalation. And what we don't, some people know it, I didn't know it, is every time you inhale, that activates the sympathetic nervous system. Every time you exhale, it activates the parasympathetic
Right.
nervous system. So if we're trying to increase time in the parasympathetic nervous system, we also have to increase time exhaling. Because every time you're inhaling, you're activating the sympathetic. So he said with box breathing, if it's 4 seconds around, just add 1 second to the exhalation.
Hmm.
And that's a little key. So, you know, doing that one. But yeah, anything you can think of. where you're just slowing your breathing.
Play is in there,
Um,
right?
yeah, play. And that's, gosh, I love the research on play. You know, they say, I think I'm trying to think of exactly how it was asked, but when we ask people or we want to know what's the opposite of play, you think work.
Yeah.
But the truth is, the opposite of play is anxiety and depression.
Hmm. It
And
totally makes sense. I mean, like, I think last time you and I were talking about it, you basically had said, and I think it's in the book, anything that makes the time go by without you noticing it, you
mhm,
know, uh, we are so beaten up with thinking that that's wasting time, with that's being not productive. It's like laziness. It's all the stuff. It, when you zoom out and look at this on a macro lens, it totally makes sense why HRV is so screwed up, because we don't, I mean, even your work week, the standard 9 to 5 or firefighters too, but you work way more than you have off, and um, the the common misconception in the public with the 24/48 schedule is like, oh, you guys have 2 days off. James Gearing did a great job of shooting that whole thing down. His explanation of it's awesome. But it really is that way. Um, so have you seen like the blue zones, where people live, everybody's like over 100 years old.
yeah,
Um, I look at those and I wonder like what, you know, I imagine the suicide rate is probably extremely low. Um, and I think it's a combination of things, but you know, without Googling it here while I'm on the podcast with you, like I would imagine their suicide rate's low, but do you have like kind of an understanding of those places? Like, how's it, do you think that it's a sense of community? Do you think it's the physical aspect that they have, or is it the diet? Is it kind of a little bit of everything?
I would imagine it's a little bit of everything.
Because their
But
suicide rate is really low, right? Like they don't have big mental health problems, if I remember
right.
correctly.
And even not looking at blue zones, but even looking at areas that had high suicide rates, where they were able to reduce suicide rates, the reductions
That's a
came
good
from
question.
community. The reductions. So there's a book that was published in 2024 last year. It's really good. It's called Facing Suicide. It was written by a journalist, not a like psychologist, but a journalist who just spent a lot of time going out to communities where there were high rates of suicide and talking to them. And it was fascinating. Firefighters were not a part of this.
Hmm.
It was Native American communities. It was athletes. It was some rural areas, and they were finding the pressure in these communities was leading to higher suicides. But then on the opposite end, they found the community was reducing suicide. And I remember as I was reading the book, I was drawing correlations between some of their solutions and things we can do in the fire service. I remember writing firehouse kitchen beside one thing, writing peer support, but none of these were formal. It was all informal. Like the Native American communities, they started having these nights that people would come in and storytelling or dancing or even knitting, and just bringing the community together. They were finding was reducing suicide. And there was one quote in the book that has become my absolute favorite quote. And now in most of my classes, it's what I start the class with. And they said, we're not going to, and this is what I should have said when you asked me the one thing that I would share about suicide for firefighters. And the answer is, we're not going to cure our way out of this crisis. And they explain that we have spent so much time looking at individuals and looking at individuals who are dying by suicide, or looking at individuals at risk and trying to fix them,
Yeah.
thinking that that's the solution, is let's fix what's wrong with these people, let's diagnose them, let's medicate them, let's give them treatment. But we've been doing that for over 2 decades, and suicide rates are going up. And what they explained is, we're not going to cure our way out of this crisis. It's the environments that are going to make a difference. It's not about the individuals we fix, it's about the environments that we create, where people feel a part of those environments, people feel that they can contribute, that they're appreciated, that they're valued. That's how we are going to, reduce suicide. And I think maybe when we think about you know, those blue areas, it's the environment.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
the environment where people feel that they are valued, that they do matter, um, that they're accepted. So
If belongingness is the most important thing, and I believe am I misquoting you when you're saying like your research was saying that like belongingness is the most important thing to mitigate risk for suicide? If that's the most important thing, like that's what culture in the fire department should center around. And it makes sense why it would be shot down all the time, because I mean, call it a generational disconnect or whatever you have, but you know, the misunderstanding, you know, between a lot of old school generation administration and then newer generations, the way they kind of need guidance, mentorship, it's very different. And then that just has a negative on culture. But I guess it leads to my next question. Like, do you think we're getting better at this? You've interviewed a lot of people. You've been around. Um, I'm hoping it seems like we're at least talking about it more. Um, and I don't know what we'd measure it by. Do you measure it by? I would say probably suicide rate, but you know, even if we're taking steps, it can't happen overnight. But if we're taking steps properly, or departments are opening up more about it, I would say that's better. But do you think the fire service is getting better at this? Because like 5 years ago, I would have said no. You know, now I'm like, I'm not. My finger's not on the pulse as much, but it feels like we're getting better. What do you think?
I think we're getting better at this. I think we still have a lot of areas to grow. And I think there's still a lot of spaces where we're not quite getting it right. But it's obvious that we're getting better at this. And I mean, I remember the biggest problem that we spoke of early on was stigma. And we contributed a lot to stigma. I think we've done a really good job of eliminating stigma. And now it's more widely accepted that mental health can impact any of us. And any of us at any point in our careers can be struggling with some sort of mental health ill effect. But I think we still have to get a little better with it. One of the things I'm seeing is that I would love for us to just improve on is I'm still seeing that when people do open up and say, hey, I need help, or hey, I went through this, they're still saying, because of my time on this job, because of the calls. They're still attributing it to the job and the calls. And I believe that there's more to it that I wish we could be honest about, because I know, man, I have some bad days, bad periods, and it has nothing to do with any of the calls. I know it has to do with me. And some of it, and a lot of it, has to do with some of my early lifehood experiences. Some of it has to do with my relationships and habits. And I recognize that those things impact me and impact how I respond to things at work. And I wish that, or I hope that that's where we can start to just be a little more honest. You know, I've seen people who have kind of gone through tough times or have hit rock bottom, and you paid attention and you saw that it probably came from being on all the time, not turning off, not resting, you know, or let's be real. You and I go to a lot of conferences, we see a lot of people, and we go to some of the social scenes, and there are some people that drink a whole lot, and it is a part of their personality. It is cool. It is awesome, and it's so dangerous and unhealthy. I mean, I've been out at places, and you know, one more round, and it's like, wow, that's a lot. Um, so we know that there are some poor habits that are contributing to things. So yes, I think overall we're definitely getting a lot better. We have resources, we have support, we have more people opening up, but I think that we're still not quite truly honest with ourselves, because I think we're still trying to blame the career for our problems, and it's not the job. And in fact, I just read an article. Sarah Jenke actually shared it in one of her Science to the Station briefs, but it was an article that was just published about first responder PTSD, and it explained that one of the things that they found that was had the greatest influence was adverse childhood experiences, was what we bring to the job, which we all know. And we also know that people who have adverse childhood experiences or people who have been abused as children, they are drawn to these professions because sometimes it is, you know, I was a victim. Now I want to be the opposite of that. And it's not to say that there's anything wrong with that, because there's not. Again, we understand that if you have adversity, when when treated appropriately, when understood, resolved, and sometimes just through talking, uh, that leads to that post traumatic growth. So we know the adversity can make us so much better. So it's not to say that bringing adverse childhood experiences should be eliminated, but it's to say we have to be open to understanding our own our own personal struggles. And we have to take, instead of going to saying, okay, I want a first responder therapist and I just want to talk about the job,
Mhm.
we have to be open to saying, I want a therapist and I want to talk about me. I want to understand why, I tend to do this, why I tend to respond to this, why this bothers me. And the book, The Beauty of a Darker Soul, that was probably one of the most eye opening books for me because Joshua Mance was a West Point graduate and he was an Army officer that was shot and almost died. At the same time, his highest ranking non commissioned officer was killed. And he ended up recovering and joining his team again. And everybody looked at him like, wow, you are the poster boy of resilience. And he ended up being somebody who spoke about resilience and post traumatic growth. And all the time while speaking, a crisis was building within him to the point where he almost took his life by suicide.
Wow.
And what I appreciate about the book and what I appreciate about him is he explained that getting shot and what he experienced in Afghanistan, that was the red herring. That was the easy scapegoat to blame for all of his problems. It wasn't until he took time, and he was the one that I loved. He said, productive suffering, like going to therapy is productive suffering. It wasn't until he took the time to slow down and explore his true sources of pain that he understood them. And then he realized it was stuff that happened long before the army that led to that crisis. And as he was the person speaking about PTSD and suicide prevention, as he was wearing that like armor, that's when it got worse for him. And I've seen that. I think I see that in our profession now. And I mean, you guys know from Florida, Chief McMahon, who died by suicide. But he also, for decades, spoke on suicide prevention, on peer support. He was at the Fallen Firefighters Foundation every year at the memorial. He was a part of the Pipes and Guns, or the Guns and Pipes,
Guns and hoses.
Guns and Hoses,
Yeah.
yeah. And I wonder if, well, I think we all know that people get drawn to this subject who it's personally affected, right? Like that's why I got drawn to it. I was suicidal at a point in my life, but I've also been at the point where people are looking to me as a source. And now when I am going through a hard time, I'm ashamed, or I feel like I can't because I'll lose credibility, that I'm supposed to be the person who struggled, got better, and now I can teach other people to get better. When that's not how it is completely. Like I'm still human, and uh, you know, we're gonna have setbacks in life. It's a part of life. And I wonder if maybe he, had a setback and couldn't ask for help because he was the helper.
It wouldn't shock me at all. John was a friend of mine. I knew him for a long time. I played bagpipes with him for almost 15 years. And I don't know. I just don't know. I know he taught at the academy a lot. I think he stopped in the last, year or two before, if I remember correctly. But he was always an instructor. He was always the go-to guy. And I think what you're saying is very, very accurate. Because just yeah, and it's a sad thing, but God rest him. Bill Gustin was the same way. You know what I mean? Like I'm in South Florida. Bill Gustin is ingrained in everybody's SOPs. And it's hard to be that person, and then worry about not being that person anymore. And it's got to be scary. But I always fear, like when we have retirees that are like everybody has their own legends, like in their department, like they're prominent people. And I always worry about them when they leave. Like, hey, do they have that hobby outside the fire service? Do they have that ability to disconnect? Do they feel that belongingness? I never thought about, what you just, what you were talking about before with us being honest with ourselves, like people not, basically doing, the red herring thing, saying like, hey, you think it's these calls. I mean, the lack of sleep really compounds things. The stress of the job compounds things. Our schedule sometimes compounds things, but yeah, being honest with ourselves, I think in this book, there's a ton of strategies and tactics for the individual, which I think is really, really big, but also peer support people. If we know, I'm going to stick to belongingness again, just linger on that one. If we know that that's such a crucial thing, if you had to give advice for people above you, like in the administration buildings and city hall and policies. You know, what's probably the most important thing when it comes to building that in the department? Like, what can they do?
Yeah. Can I shift topics real quick? Because I think I want to hit on something I think is important.
Please.
I talked about Chief McMahon and Bill Guston. So they both died by suicide, and handguns were the cause of both of their deaths.
Right.
And I believe both of them died in the middle of the night or early morning. So in a time where support isn't readily available. So I think it's difficult to talk about, but I think it's so important to talk about is we know most suicides happen between midnight and 4 a.m. And people who have access to guns are more likely to die by suicide. We know that. That's a fact. And first responders are people who are protectors. So most of us have access to guns, and most of us have guns, and most of us don't secure them because we want to be ready. But we don't realize that in doing so, we are increasing our risk for suicide. Just having a loaded handgun in the home will increase your risk for suicide 6 to 8 times. And one study in Colorado found that 83% of service members who died by handguns, their deaths were suicides. So all that's to say, not to say get rid of your handguns, we shouldn't have handguns, but all that's to say is it's really important to understand that if you have a handgun and you're going through a difficult time in life, your risk for suicide is increased. Because what we know about suicide is when somebody is in suicide intensity, which is not a state that lasts very long. So suicide intensity ebbs and flows. And in one day, you may have several peaks where you're in suicide intensity, especially when you're going through a really hard time. Or for some people, it may happen just once a week. You have this peak, but it doesn't last. It ebbs and flows. And if you can get through that peak, it's going to come down. So that's why we know sometimes you don't have to put somebody in a hospital for 72 hours. Sometimes you just have to go sit with somebody and get them through that time, get them to, give you your guns until they get through that time. But for each of us, because we still aren't great at admitting when we're struggling, especially if we don't understand why we're struggling or we're ashamed. We're still not great at that. And we still feel like we have to have our handgun. So for us, we have to understand if you have your handgun, you're going through a hard time, your risk for suicide is increased. But there are things we can do. First and foremost, if you're going through a hard time and you're having thoughts of suicide, lock your guns up, store them out of the house. Just get them out of the house for a while. It doesn't have to be permanent, just a while. But we also know just having a safe, putting your handgun in a safe can make a difference, especially if you have to think through opening the safe. If you have to take some slow, deep breaths, because that's twofold. When you take those slow, deep breaths, you activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which turns on the prefrontal cortex. So oftentimes when people are in suicide intensity, they're in that sympathetic system. Their ability to think about the future is not there. That's why they're able to die by suicide when they probably don't even want to. It's because they're not able to logically think. But if we can slow down our breathing, we can take some deep breaths, that can give us time to think, give us time to think about the future, give us time to think about reasons to live. So I say all this to say, because I think if we don't take the lessons from Chief McMahon and Bill Guston, and we don't find a way to help other people, we won't do it justice. So I've known for a long time how handguns can contribute to suicide, and how not storing them appropriately, or when you're going through a hard time, just keeping them out, how that can contribute to suicide. This has always been a hard conversation to have with first responders, because they're like, oh, gun control, you can't do that to me, or we need them. But now I hope that we understand, don't be afraid to have the conversation with somebody you care about if they're going through a hard time. Don't be afraid to have that conversation with yourself and lock your gun up.
Yeah.
You can disassemble it. You can store the ammunition separate, especially if you're going through a hard time. Another really neat idea, and I was listening to Craig Bryan, who works with military populations and studies suicides, and he was talking to a veteran who was having a lot of, very often he was thinking about suicide. Well, Dr. Bryan was able to get him to store his gun in a lockbox. And afterwards they talked, and he said, since getting the handgun out of sight, I'm not thinking about suicide as often. Just having it out of sight made a difference. But another bit of advice he had was put a crisis card, create a crisis card, and put it on your handgun in the safe. And on that crisis card, just have the names of 3 people you can call, have 3 active activities you can do to slow yourself down. Have the number for the suicide prevention lifeline on there. Have the number of somebody you love, or just their name on there. But put this crisis card with your gun, and if you are having intense thoughts of suicide, hopefully you pick up that card first, and in doing so, that buys a little time for that rational brain to come back online and you to think of other options. So I just want to make sure we talked about that, because for me, I think that's probably one of the most important conversations. Again, suicide, there's no effective algorithm to predict suicide. We can know risk factors and warning signs, but that's not going to help us predict suicide. That's science. We know it. No effective algorithm to predict suicide. Retrospectively, we can look back and understand suicide, but you can't look at people and know who's going to kill themselves. Absolutely can't do that. There's no way. So instead of us constantly trying to look for people to intervene on, we have to give people tools to survive their crisis moments. And all of us have to think about this and think of it in a way that we may find ourselves in crisis at any point. And let's live our lives that way and share it with the people around us. Because even if I may never be there, if I live my life that way, model it, share it with the people around me, hopefully they'll do the same. And hopefully if we take lessons from these losses, hopefully these lessons can prevent future losses. Does that make any sense?
A ton, and I'm glad you brought that up and didn't change the subject off of them too early, because it was a part of the book I read, and I it's just crucial. But with that, I think it's extremely important, because I think a lot of people, a lot of us do have handguns, and you're obviously not, thinking about that all the time, but it's literally a matter of life and death sometimes. And if it is very fleeting, then we have to understand that this is a simple step. So I'm glad you lingered on that, and then you addressed it. So with advice, and it's funny because the part of the book that I liked was like, I think you quoted like Matthew McConaughey. It's about giving advice. Be like, the best people to get advice from people that don't give advice. So I'm gonna I'm gonna ask your advice anyway. But if you had to give advice to people above you, chiefs in particular, or policymakers, what is the best thing that they could do to kind of create that belongingness? What's like the low hanging fruit? Like, what's the easy stuff? Everyone thinks like culture change. Culture change is huge. I mean, we could do an entire series on that. We don't have to do just one podcast, but I think there's probably some big mistakes that people commonly make. How do they avoid those? Like, what's the easy stuff?
Don't give advice. Just kidding. Just kidding. Hey, and
We'll start there.
Yeah, done. The reason that's so important, especially like in peer support and helping people, is the key to improving our situations lies in our ability to make the decision to change. So as long as somebody's giving advice, it's not you that's making that decision. So the key to supporting others is to find a way to, you can still give advice, but not by saying, hey, John, this is what you need to do. You need to start sleeping 7 hours. You need to take more time off. If I tell you all this, you don't have agency. You're just doing what I'm telling you. However, if I find a way to communicate it to where you're like, wow, I didn't know that REM sleep is so important for processing memories. I'm going to sleep 7 hours. So I've got to be able to communicate in a way that makes you want to sleep 7 hours instead of just sleeping 7 hours. And that's how we see real change. I think the low-hanging fruit is simple. Remembering we're not going to cure our way out of this crisis. It's about the environments we create. So how do we create these environments? It's even simpler than that. I loved the book, The Culture Code, and how they just broke down the word culture to caring. So if you want to improve culture, if you want to create an environment where people thrive, just care. Care about the people you work with. And the hardest thing for any of us to do is stop being preoccupied with ourselves and start caring about others. And going back to like my role as a battalion chief and leadership, that's one of the biggest things I had to learn. Was it was no longer about me walking in and showing people how smart I am and telling them everything I know. It's about me walking in and learning from them and asking them about, who they are, or about what they're working on, or what they've learned. And hey, I've heard that you took this class. Can you tell us a little bit about it? Going up to like a 6 month person and asking them. Or, a big thing that I try to do, and it's hard with a lot of people in the battalion, but I try to, without being like creepy and saying, John, what's your spouse's name? What are your kids' names? I try to ask questions and pay attention, and then sneak off in my phone and write down names. And then that way, next time I come in, I'm like, hey, how's this person doing? How's Emmett doing? How's Zayden doing? Like asking them about their kids, using their names and showing interest. So I think low hanging fruit is just to remember, care about people and show interest in them. If we think, and I quote a lot of books on these conversations, one of the most recommended books for like leaders and getting along with people is the book How to Win Friends and Influence People. And in there, Dale Carnegie just talked about people want you to ask about them. They want you to remember their name, and they want you to ask them questions. They don't want you to talk about yourself. They want you to give them an opportunity to talk. So I try to remember that when I go out is, how can I make people feel like I care about them and that I'm genuinely interested in who they are?
This is kind of what worries me sometimes about, not that I would ever want to be the chief of my organization, because it's a no-win situation there. But basically every decision that the chief makes is going to be just categorized immediately, good or bad. And good would be for the guys, bad would be against them. And it's like, have to take. Sometimes you got to make tough decisions, but you have to take those decisions with weight, knowing that's how it'll come across. Like, do they care? Do they not care? Um, at a company officer level, just from what I'm gathering, it's probably the most important. Is like, you can create that environment in your firehouse at a company officer level, regardless of what the administration does. And a friend of mine, Chris Morello, does the tailboard fourth shift. He's like the fourth shift firefighter. He does like Tailboard Talks podcast. They did a great conversation about that, about the effect of morale, and probably has more to do with the officers in the middle than it does the chiefs at the top. And as far as your firehouse goes, yeah, people could be frustrated with the administration, but coming to work every day, make or break, is probably more to do with your captain in your battalion than, or your lieutenant in your battalion, than it does, the fire chief. So that is crazy important. Like, your first line of defense peer support team is your crew. I like that tactic of writing down the names. That's pretty good. I got to try to remember that.
Yeah, use the notes on your phone.
Yes, legit. So fairly recently, I just got put at a firehouse. I was an admin for 2 years. I just got put out at the beginning of May, end of April. So I'm really excited about that. But it's a really steep learning curve. I went from being behind a desk to being in charge of a firehouse, 1 week to the next, and it's been really great. But the challenges are so different. I like it, but
Yeah.
The creating that environment is the key, and I'm still learning how to do it. I'm probably going to be learning how to do it for the rest of my career, but it's fun. I like it. All that stuff about getting people to understand that you care is really what I want to do. So I hope other people hear this and are inspired to do that stuff, but also knowing that the book that you wrote just lays out so many good tactics and strategies. And there's a ton of footwork that you've done over the years, both with like the articles, but I appreciated the interviews that you did with people. It is so cool. And I was totally jealous that you got to speak with Matt Walker, because that guy is like, he's really changed my perception on how sleep works in the human body and why it's so important to us. But if you guys haven't gotten the book, Hope Out of Darkness, Battalion Chief Dena Ali wrote it. And she is really changing the game with how we view mental health, but also how we act on it. And I think this is the first book, just my testimony of it. This is the first book I've read where I read it and I'm like, we have actionable steps. I understand the concept of fishing people out before they get there. I know how to look out for that stuff. I know how to create the environment to have them do it themselves, and how to share, how to share these tools with other people, and just the little stuff like approaching these conversations. A lot of people don't want to start the conversation because it's scary. They're worried, like,
Yeah.
what happens if I ask someone if they're, hey, are you doing okay? And they say no. And you're like, oh shit, I did not want to go down this road.
Right.
So I appreciate the fact that, you put a lot of stuff in there. So it's an incredible read. I hope everybody gets it. And the best place to get it, where do you recommend? I know it's on Amazon, but it's through Fire Engineering. Where should people get this?
Yeah, those are the two spots, Amazon and Fire Engineering.
Okay.
Amazon, shipping, depending on if you're a member, shipping's free. Uh, and then there's a couple of other, firefighter bookstores that have it. I know there's one in Canada because I guess shipping in Canada is really tough, but I can't remember their name off the top of my head, which I'm embarrassed about that. But yeah, Amazon is
We'll
where I
clip
send
that
a
out.
lot
We'll
of
throw it in later.
yeah, I send a lot of people to Amazon just because the free shipping,
Cool.
but and it doesn't take away from Fire Engineering because Fire Engineering sells to Amazon.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah. So either one, whichever one's more convenient then. So Amazon or Fire Engineering. That's great. Yeah, it was a great read. I bought 2 copies, gave one to my peer support leader, and, looking to get his feedback on it too. So if anybody um, has any other questions about the stuff, or like follow up or whatever, where do people find you, or maybe some articles that you've written? Like, I know obviously I'll put the ones that you've written on Fire Engineering in the show notes, but yeah, if people want to get a hold of you, how do they do that?
I think just finding me on Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn. A
Perfect.
lot of people find me like through those messaging, and I'll hit them
Cool.
back up. And I just want to say I love what you said about the company officer and their role, because you're absolutely right. That's a big thing. I have 8 companies in my battalion,
Hmm.
and I see that the company officer creates the environment that dictates how people feel about coming to work. And if, because of course there's always stuff that administration does that aggravates people. And so if the company officer feeds into that and they just sit around and commiserate, they're miserable and everything makes them miserable. But it's really cool when you go into firehouses and they don't care what's going on outside that firehouse. What they care about is what's going on in that firehouse.
Yeah.
It's so cool to see how the company officer can create the most positive environment regardless of what's going on out there. And one of my favorite things to always say is I'd love to put peer support out of business because we have it already.
Yeah.
Our companies are peer support. And if we're doing it right, we shouldn't ever truly need external strangers. We should have what we need right within our companies.
I quote you on that all the time. I paraphrase that and I tell other people that you say that because I think it's huge. Before I let you go, we always talk about books. What are some new recommendations if you have any?
I do, and actually, hold on, let me grab it because I
Yep.
can't remember the title off the top of my head. So I talked about. Actually, I have 2 of them right here.
Nice.
So many books are all over my house. So I talked about facing suicide. That's one of my favorites. I just read this. We Can Do Hard Things. I will say this was written by 3 women, and it's more of a female's perspective. But I appreciated this.
Cool.
We Can Do Hard Things. However, for the fire service and probably for your listeners, I'm not done with it yet. I just started reading it. But on character.
Hmm.
Choices That Define a Life by General Stanley McChrystal.
Wow.
And if you remember, he was really influential, and then was fired from the White House, and so went from the highest high to like the lowest low, but then he bounced back. He didn't let that define him. But what I appreciate about this book is, it gives a lot of advice through storytelling about like mindset, about discipline, but also about setbacks. And about perspective. And I've been learning so much reading this. I've had just so much appreciation for it. And it's one of those books that like I can't wait to go like have time to read and keep reading it. So highly recommend
Nice.
On Character.
Awesome. Very cool. I'll have to put those down. So I'm going to put those in the show notes too. If anybody has the audio version of this if they're listening on Spotify, not YouTube, and then you can click on them there and check them out. So I appreciate you sharing that, and also just for everything you've done for the fire service in general. I know you've put in a ton of hours on your own time just to kind of understand this problem, and a lot of the conversation that we're having now today and kind of the stigma getting gone away is because of work like that you've done. So I appreciate it immensely, and I just hope people get really good use out of it. I hope some of this stuff gets brought to light and we put it into practice. So Chief Ali, thank you so much for being here, for all the work that you've done, and for writing such a kick-ass book. I hope everybody gets it, and it's available on Amazon and on fireengineering.com. Hope Out of Darkness. Thank you for being here.
Oh man, thanks for having me. I love talking to you. This was great. I
Likewise.
appreciate it.
Likewise.